Hello and welcome to the Hospital Rooms Digital Art School. You're about to watch a landscape painting workshop with artist Stephanie Nebbia. You'll find the materials that you'll need for this workshop listed below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel. Enjoy the workshop!
Hello, thank you for joining me on my Hospital Rooms workshop today. My name is Stephanie Nebbia. I'm an artist who lives and works in South London. My focus is on landscape, macro and micro, and I will be talking today about making colour studies in landscape using colour and texture. I start all my ideas working from observation, either using my sketchbook or taking photographs of those, as I've done here. All of these photographs you can find on the resource pack to download and work from, as I'm going to do today. And as you can see in my observational studies in my sketchbook, I like to experiment with texture and really play around with colour. I've used watercolour, pastel and all sorts of things here. I use an extensive palette when I'm starting to really develop my ideas, like this one. But just to begin with, I like to keep it really simple and just start with red, yellow and blue and really start to experiment with different textures and ways of working. When I'm working on sort of more developed pieces of work, I will use archival mediums, but at this stage, it's a good idea to use just some wax, some soap and some salt, things that you have at home that are inexpensive, and it means that you're more relaxed about making lots of studies and not being precious about the outcomes. So the only other thing you'll need is some brushes and some water, and I have a viewfinder here which I will explain a little bit more about in a moment, that is good for working outside when you're looking at landscape, but also for really reducing down your subject matter. So when I'm working outside doing some observational studies, it can be very difficult to identify your subject matter. It can be really distracting. It can be less so when you're taking a photograph because you're looking through a lens. So in a way, it really helps you sort of construct an initial composition. So I have this device that I call my Constable viewfinder, which is something that I learnt to use when I was a student. And it's a really good way of, when you're out in the landscape, of identifying what your composition is going to be. Then I found it really useful to actually break down my compositions, even through my photographs, to sort of really think about what interests me most. I'm particularly interested in the macro, micro, how we inhabit space, how we interact with nature. And so I'm always looking at how detail reflects the whole. I was really always interested in Cézanne, who used to talk about making every mark as though it's the last. So I became very aware of not doing things that weren't necessary, or just putting things down for the sake of it, and trying to avoid making any kind of arbitrary decisions and thinking very carefully about each mark and colour that I was using. And then all of this research manifests itself either in my paintings or in my printmaking. So for this session, I'm going to start with this image, and I'm going to use it as the basis of all my studies. I like the simplicity of it. I like the soft orange and blue that's coming through with this warmer, earthier sort of orangey brown in the foreground. So I'm going to put that just to one side where I can see it, and I'm going to start by getting out my red, yellow and blue. The reason I like to use just 3 colours is because, as I said, I like to not make arbitrary decisions. So as I start to introduce other colours later on, I'm really thinking about why and what they're going to do. So I've got my red and my yellow and blue, and I am just going to see what it can do first of all. So I like to explore what blue I'm using, what its potential is, and what my tools can do. So here I've done it with all three colours, and now it means that I can start to think about how I'm going to mix some of these colours together to see what different secondary colours I can create from my primaries. So now I want to see what my colours do when I mix them together. So I'm going to take my blue, and I'm just going to fill in the top of my square, almost creating a kind of wash. If I was really filling in the wash and I wanted to be really careful about not creating streaks, I would wiggle it from side to side to really disperse the pigment, because you can see already that you're getting a really, really even wash by doing that sort of wiggling action. Now I'm going to take my red, and I'm going to work from the bottom this time so that you can keep a really nice red, and I'm going to use the wiggling action to create a nice even wash. And you can see as it starts to move into the blue, you're getting these lovely sort of biases towards violet. I like the way that the line becomes diffused as it mixes with the wet blue. I want to add a little bit of blue now to that red to just start to look at the violets I can achieve. Now I'm going to leave that to dry because I want to see what happens when it starts to settle and how many different tones I can create. So now that I've got red on my brush already, I'm going to take it into this square, and well, it's not really a square, it's more of a rectangle, and you can see as I'm wiggling my brush it helps me really evenly disperse the pigment. And this works on a really large scale too. If you wanted to make a really big beautiful wash, that wiggling technique really is helpful. Now I'm really going to make sure my brush is nice and clean as I hit the yellow, and I'm going to work my way back up to see my oranges appear, and adding a little bit of the red just to create some interesting textures by the addition of the water, because you can see it's really breaking up the sort of lovely flat washes. You're getting these really interesting textures just by the way in which the paint is being applied. So now I'm going to use yellow and work my way down and add the blue. So I've gone round my palette and round the three primaries. So you can see the greens are starting to really mix. And what's interesting here is that the yellow is quite powerful, and it's really starting to sort of provide quite a lot of hiding power in the blue and dominates. I can add a little bit more blue there to get those. So while those are drying, and we can enjoy the textures that are being created by the wet and dry surface, I just want to introduce some other ways in which to create texture. So having identified my kind of composition and the simplicity of it, I want to start looking at creating differences in texture between the sky and the landscape, and then really enjoying this horizon that can be created, that I've started to see reveal itself in my colour mixing. So I'm going to use some additions to my paint to really bring out some of these textures. So I'm just using a candle, it could be a birthday candle, household candle, and I'm just going to put my horizon in there, and I just want to use some of my mark making to talk about the space coming towards you, but also the fact that it's a sandy surface. And I'm just going to use one colour to begin with, which I'm going to use the blue, to look at how it responds to the wax resist surface that I've created. And you can see it's already created a strong texture between the landscape and the sky. Now what I would like to do is leave that to sit while I think about using one of the other colours and adding some other texture there. So this time I'm going to use some of the red paint, and I'm just going to put that all the way down as we did before, and then use my wiggling motion to make it a more even wash. And this time I'm going to add some salt. Now you can use any kind of salt, but obviously depending on the size and the quantity, you'll get variations in texture. So I've got really fine sort of table salt here, and then I've got a couple of rock salt crystals. Now the thing to do is to make sure it completely dries before you think about removing it. And the other thing you can do is actually, having looked at this lovely strong light line in the horizon, you can actually use the white of the paper to create that effect. So I'm just going to now give myself a little bit of light in a horizon there, and this time I want to use soap. It's a really good way of using up those really small bits of soap that are actually quite difficult to wash your hands with when you want them. And soap adds texture. You can, of course, as I mentioned before, use texture medium, which is really beautiful to use, and it is archival. But when you're just figuring out if texture is something you want, this is a really nice, inexpensive way of doing it. And here you can see it retains the brush strokes and gives you a really nice bit of texture. You can also start thinking about the sky coming overhead and creating something a bit stronger there too. So there we've got studies of working on wet surfaces and watching colour blend together and starting to achieve secondary colours, and then introducing just wax, salt and soap to create different textures. Now I can work back into these things using my soap marks to create more texture in these compositions now they've dried a little bit, and also bringing in more colour to make it a stronger, defined difference in colours that can be achieved, and really thinking about using heavier areas of colour, not necessarily just light washes. And of course you can lift off any of the marks if you feel they're too heavy. I like to leave a little bit because I really enjoy the different textures that can be achieved. So these are my sort of initial experiments coming from my sketches and my photographs before they manifest themselves into ideas for paintings or prints. And here's one I've done earlier where I've removed the masking tape, but it's also shows you how each of the outcomes can be very, very different, and that's the beauty of it. There isn't one way of doing any of these things. There isn't one particular red, yellow or blue to use. If you didn't have paint, you could even use food colouring if you wanted to, because when you're experimenting and making studies, you don't have to worry about longevity of the works just to create these resources. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my hospital rooms workshop today. Thank you for listening.